I'm Austin Chambers, author of the Cascadia Fallen books and a small YouTube channel, Cross Cannons Readiness. I was a career DoD employee, and many years ago I had rode out an earthquake in a dry dock in a Naval Shipyard. And before that, I'd been a firefighter, and I always had in my mind to one day write a story about a massive earthquake and how it affects the Navy. And then ultimately, as I started approaching 50, I wanted to get that off the bucket list a little bit. And it turned out to be probably one of the main subplots of the storyline. So I'm also an active volunteer range officer and instructor at my local gun range. And, I really got into preparedness about 10 years back. And so I've always thought, man, this would be a great location to kind of have an emergency base camp or something if there's ever a massive natural disaster. And so really what Cascadia Fallen is about in book 1 is Tahoma's Hammer is, if you live in the Pacific Northwest or if you've ever heard of the Cascadia subduction zone, we're right in the middle of the 300 to 500 year range for the next big 9.0 earthquake off the coast of Washington State. It's a 600-mile long subduction zone. I decided to write a story about, a couple 100-mile section of that drops 4 feet and triggers a 9.0 earthquake that makes Mount Rainier erupt. It's something that can happen. I basically wrote the main trilogy as the disasters are the theme to actually present the story, which is what happens when there's such a massive amount of devastation to airports, seaports, bridges, dams, highways, it makes them all completely unusable. And if you ever really look at how isolated the Seattle-Portland area is from the rest of the country, as far as distance goes, you realize the best way, if all of those things collapsed at once, would be to get supplies and people there would probably be parachute. So really they're isolated in this world where all of the infrastructure has been completely wiped out and devastated. And now it's about the good people having to spring up and learn to help each other and protect each other. And the bad people are immediately organizing to take advantage of the situation. The primary protagonist is Phil Walker. And Phil's the executive officer of the West Sound Sportsman's Club in Slaughter County. So basically, with the exception of my own county, everything is more or less true to name. As a new author, I didn't know how much license I was going to need to have some flexibility on plot and setting and stuff like that. And on top of that, at the time when I started writing these, I was a manager in the Department of Defense. And so I wanted to fictionalize the Naval Shipyard that's in the story. I wanted to fictionalize the county to maintain some creative license. And the gun range and everything is largely based on my real gun club, which is Kitsap Rifle and Revolver Club. However, I wanted to make sure that, I reserved my rights as an author to make sure that people understand I was writing a fictional story. Back when I was working at the Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, I've had a few people say, hey man, I appreciate you put me in the book or whatever, something to that effect. And I go, you weren't in the book. Oh yeah, but you character Nick. I was like, wait a minute, I know like 3 Nicks just in this building. And on top of that, I had run a contest where a fan got to name a couple of characters and they named them after his kids, right? I go, that Nick was named after some guy's kid, right? So it's kind of funny. I went out of my way to try to not base any one character on a real person. But the problem is, as a writer, you're drawing inspiration from real life. And so you do take elements of a person. And sometimes there's a personality, or she is so dynamic that you really do kind of make a character like that person. And there might be a couple of those in the book series, but more or less what I wanted to do was fictionalize the characters and then take real friends of mine and pay tribute to them by using a name, usually a last name or a first name. Now, what's kind of cool about this is through my book series and through online networking and just social media and stuff, I befriended a guy in Ireland who's a really great friend of mine now. I call him Cousin because Austin Chambers is my pen name, but my real name is very Irish. And he and I have become good friends through social media. And so I named a character after him in book 3. And of course, the character has a demise waiting for him. And so this guy messaged me when he got to that part, and he was a little bit distraught. Apparently this character had a demise that was very similar to one of his greatest phobias, so completely coincidental. A lot of people ask if, hey, is Phil, the main character, is that the gun range's real executive officer? And I would have to say no specifically. He's just a guy I made up in my head. But I will say this, I do consider that man one of my mentors in life. And he and I are very similar in a lot of beliefs, including, the state of how the country was founded as a republic, a constitutional republic, and things like that. And he's not a former Marine. The character is. He was in the Army as an MP or something, or the Army Reserves. I was in the Navy. So really, Phil, the main character, is this former Marine who happens to do the same job as my friend from the real gun range. But Phil could easily identify as either he or I just because of his moral code, right? Phil's a pretty pragmatic guy. And so I still opened up the first book with a kind of a prologue that sets up a couple of things about Phil. One, he's willing to rush into danger, a decision he made years earlier to defend his community. And then it cost him a half a leg that gets shattered by an AK round. Phil is kind of a pragmatic guy, and so he's got a below the knee prosthetic on one leg, which is kind of his flaw that he has to deal with. He is a widower, and the main story happens a few years later. But the other thing I set up in that initial shootout was his life was saved by a deputy named Charlie, and they're really kind of best friends. And that best friend tension carries itself because sometimes, your biggest fights are with your friends that know you the best, right? So they have a falling out in the middle of the books, and I got to have them make up, right? It's just a lot of parallels in life to a lot of my readers. Hey man, I really related to those guys, and especially when they didn't see eye to eye on a couple of topics. We have a guy that is not into preparedness at all, whose children were on a field trip to Seattle that day. And he takes it upon himself to get over there and try to find his kids. There was a character who's a Los Angeles doctor who happens to be flying home from SeaTac, and a young, 20-year-old female sailor that was going to go home to LA to, on some leave from the military. And they have to work together now that they can't fly home, because everything's been destroyed, including runways, to get back over to the west side of Puget Sound, or to Slaughter County. And so they start working together, and they're complete polar opposites in their personality. Neither one of them are really prepared for what's going on. And they come across another pair of guys that really don't even get names in book one. And these guys help them out. They have a Silcock key, and they're getting some water right off the pressurized system that's left in a commercial building, filling up water bottles. And these other men can tell, hey, these aren't just your average dirt bags. So they help them out a little bit, give them some advice, send them on their way. And then I rewrote that scene, that interaction, in the second book from the perspective of the other two guys. And a lot of people come back and go, oh man, that was really cool. And I hadn't even planned on doing that. I did fall for those two characters. I wanted to expand those guys' world a little bit as I was writing the second book. And I also went back in time in the second book as I'm introducing them, and a really vile predator type character and a couple of other new characters in book two that carry through book 2 and 3. And I wanted to expand those, so I said, let's go back in time and tell the earthquake all over from some of these new characters' perspective. I didn't go into it nearly as deep as in book 1, but it was kind of cool to be able to rewrite that scene again, something I hadn't planned on doing. And I had to go back into book 1 and get the dialogue exactly the same. But now you're inside the thought of the other main character, right? This guy that was helping them in book 1 is now a main character in book 2. And it wound up being a trilogy where book 1 is really just about the core gun range, kind of getting their feet under them, and a couple of subplots. So I just explored all these different dynamics, but all the stories do wind up tying together. And in book 2, it kind of evolves the characters into people across Puget Sound, and in book 3, it does so even more. And in each book builds upon the other as far as the levels of what the bad guys are organizing and doing. And it is post-apocalyptic dystopian genre, so of course I had a little liberty to make it fun and exciting. It is very scary. I've had a lot of people that really aren't into preparedness, and friends from my old job that maybe align politically neutral or even left, but we're still friends. And they come up to me later on and they want to know more about how to get into preparedness and, how to defend themselves and how to organize for, even if it's not so kind of over the top, because in this book, the main bad guys wind up being a cartel that organizes all the crime and gang together. It does wake people up. I've had people come and say, man, this scared the crap out of me. I couldn't sleep for 3 days. I do intersperse preparedness tips inside this storyline, enough that you can pick some things up. That's one of the things I really enjoyed about reading a lot of the bigger prepper series and novels that have been out there for many years. One thing I did not want to do was turn it into an instruction manual. Now, I did hire an editor, and she veered me away from a couple of things where I had just gotten too technical because it wasn't supporting plot for 5 or 6 or 7 paragraphs. But there was a time or two when I had to defend my ground on that and say, no, this is what my readers want, is they want to know about how this radio network is going to work and be able to relay information through ham radio up and down the county or whatever. So there's some of that in there, but it's not enough to destroy the plot or distract you. And I just like to intersperse little tips from my real life in there. A good example is in book 1. Of course, I start with some teaser earthquakes, similar to the one I rode a scaffold on in that dry dock back in 2001. But the big ones happen in chapter 5. And so after that, the main protagonist of the story, his truck got flipped to the side of the road and destroyed. And he winds up needing to hike to his gun range, which is his nearest resource to go to. And he's got a can with him in his get-home bag and his metal can. And in this metal can is where he stored his food, his ham radio, and a few other resources. And the reason I use a metal can in my real one is because it's rat-proof. Now, you can actually pull the gasket out of that metal can and put a little steel wool in there, and it's a pretty good Faraday cage, too. I keep my ham radio inside of an EMF-resistant bag inside that can. To me, I live in Western Washington. The greater threat to my radio is rain, so I keep the gasket in there. But I lost a $130 rolling duffel bag in my garage one time because a mouse chewed right through it to get to a protein bar. So I've learned ever since then, anything that, foods, medicines, that kind of stuff, keep them in a metal can, even in your vehicle, right? So, but that's an example where he's carrying his can and he's got some food to eat when he gets to the range that night after the big earthquakes have hit. So that's an example of the preparedness tips and stuff. Part of the narratives, about every 4 or 5 chapters in all of the books, I would go with some narratives about what's happening in the rest of the world and in the rest of the country. And those circles keep to expand as the books move on. And think about the reality of this. And really, I didn't even think about these things till I was writing it. I asked myself what if a lot as I was writing these books. What if the internet, so Washington State is the nation's leading exporter of hydroelectric power, mostly to California. What if the Northwest states quit exporting power entirely one day? Just all of the power they export is gone because all of the dams are broken or flooded. What if Amazon's chief HQ in Seattle, Boeing's chief HQ in Seattle, and Microsoft's chief HQ in Seattle all quit working one day? How would that affect power, the internet, commerce, the cloud server systems? All of those things I took some writer's liberty with and kind of destroyed them, not just for this story, but to paint a narrative and a dynamic of impacts to the rest of the country and the world. The rest of the country now goes through rolling blackouts that eventually become sustained days-long blackouts. The cloud, business immediately are susceptible to loss of revenue, hacking, loss of data they need. And I'm talking not just businesses, but governments, right? Because the cloud has been severely impacted by these companies that were destroyed in one day. And of course, there's a world dynamic to it where other nations that feel like it's their due for their shot to kind of be the top dog, start vying with each other first, to jockey for a power position. And so I paint those narratives every few chapters in these books as a way of setting up my spin-off series. The coming series, there's actually going to be 2. I left one thread dangling, not really related to this stuff, but it'll be more of an action thriller series. And that's about a guy in the books that's going to go after a missing kid. And it's going to be really more about, it'll still be set in the same universe. It's going to be about human trafficking and that kind of stuff. And that's going to be the secondary spinoff. I'll call that Connor's mission. The primary mission that's coming probably in January or February of 2022. It's called Blades of Grass. And if you're a student of history, you know there's this myth out there about the Japanese admiral Yamamoto saying, hey, we're not going to attack American mainland because behind every blade of grass there'd be an American with a rifle. Now, the source of that's never been verified. Apparently it comes from Admiral MacArthur, or General MacArthur's primary historian, in a letter that he collected in volumes and volumes of stuff. I'm talking warehouse full of materials that MacArthur's actual private historian collected. So, but whether or not it's a verified fact that some admiral said that from Japan, it does hold true. And in fact, I would say that that concept is probably a primary reason why certain nation states don't have more aggressive stances toward us to this day, because they wouldn't be able to transport enough of their army to this country if they wanted to attack us to make up for the human populace that's behind our military and police forces, right? So that said, the Blades of Grass concept is going to take all of that narrative I set up in the original trilogy and expand on the what if to the rest of the country. After these events happened in the Pacific Northwest, we're going to start following characters in the rest of America as it's dealing with the loss of the power of the internet, and these things keep getting worse every day, and the cartelification of things as aggressive actors come in and start taking advantage of the situation. And I don't want to spoil it, but the trilogy ends on a pretty big bang cliffhanger that leads right into this other series. So I'm actually going to go back to the beginning of the events in the first book, and in that book at the same time, as this cliffhanger events unfolding. But the whole dynamic of that Blades of Grass series, and it'll probably be at least 5 or 6 books, will be about the state of the world changed by the impact of the whole Rainier impact zone that happened in Cascadia Fallen. So if you want to find my books or more about me, author.austinchambers.com. I'm continuously expanding that website. I've started doing some patriotic themed t-shirts through that. My book series are through that. They'll actually link you to my author page on Amazon. My books are available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook. There's a newsletter you can sign up for at the bottom on the homepage, and it's mostly an author newsletter. It's keeping on top of my release information, next book series, cover reveals, things like that. But I also include, if you sign up for that newsletter, you get a free chapter 0 to this book, which kind of tells the story of the bad guys that lead right up to that opening prologue shootout, right? And then you also get a 10,000 word short story that I've written called The Splintered Moon, which is totally unrelated to this. I do intersperse that newsletter with preparedness tips from time to time. I realized, unlike traditional authors, I have a kind of a split audience. Most of my audience likes preparedness too, and so it's kind of a blended mixture of stuff on my newsletter. I'm also on social media. It's the Austin Chambers Reader page, and I do a little bit of Instagram. Both I have an author profile and a Cross Cannons Readiness profile, more for preparedness stuff. And my email is austin@author.austinchambers.com. Here at the Panhandle Preparedness Expo in Sandpoint, and the first time I came to this, I was a patron. I hadn't even written the book yet, and so I wrote the books, and I started an AmRonNet back in my home county 3 years ago, based on coming to this expo. And by the next expo in 2019, I was here selling as an author. I had only had the one book out at the time. And then last year I couldn't make it because my son got married the same weekend. But now I'm back. And this year they were looking for some featured speakers. One thing I'm going to present today plays heavily out of this book series, which is how to set up an emergency base camp. So again, I mentioned in the main story arc, a group of gun club members all kind of meet at the range and in an impromptu fashion set up an emergency base camp. But other story lines and groups in books 2 and 3, I dive back into that with various experience levels and techniques. So as you read the trilogy, you actually learn multiple ways to be able to defend your community, to set up security, to set up communications based on experience levels and things like that. As far as live events, I try to hit this expo in Sandpoint, Idaho every year. The last few years it's been the first weekend in October. There's a Preparedness Expo during the last issues of 2020 and 2021. I don't think they've had it, but in Prosser, Washington, it happens to be an actually big one, even though it's in a smaller community, away from the big communities on the west side of the state. And so if Prosser, Washington gets going again, keep an eye on that as a expo every spring. I believe it's the Northwest Preparedness Expo, and I believe that happens usually in springs. If they get that going again, keep an eye out. There used to be an expo, the one and only one I ever went to in Portland in 2016. If they ever bring that back, we'll go to that, obviously. And I was part of the team that built the Puget Sound Preparedness Expo in 2019. If that team ever gets back together after the global issues and we try to put together another expo, we'll be sure and widely advertise that. And that was in Bremerton, Washington. One of my goals as an author is to have the success to be able to fly across the country to North Carolina twice per year. And if you're in that area, I advise you go to these anyhow. Heritage Life Skills, run by Carolina Readiness Supply. I don't know the exact name of the town, but it's in North Carolina. And also in the fall every year, there's a big one called Prepper Camp. You got to buy tickets to that one, and you can actually camp at it. But it's they have classes all day long in multiple locations for 3 days straight. And pretty much all of the preparedness experts in this country wind up at that one every September. So one of these days, I'll be one of those guys.
Well, that's all I have for this video. Bang around that bell icon if you want to be notified when new videos come out. Call us on the hotline if you have comments or questions and want to be featured in an upcoming video. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe. Check us out on the website, and we'll see you guys on the next one.
It's the American Redoubt Radio Operators Network, and it's just a network. And there's other ones in the country, and they all do great things. Comms Connect, this is one I can think of, and they're just a non-radio club-based network of radio operators that aren't really about so much a social club, but they specifically work to operate emergency networks to help their communities in times of disaster and stuff. And one of the things they'll even do there, at least in Amron, they have the Channel 3 project where they actually work in into their net, a way to communicate with, for a net operator to send the people who are below him in the net out to go start making contacts in the free to use channels like CB Channel 3, MERS Channel 3, that kind of stuff, right? So FRS, Family Radio Channel 3. So I work the Amron network into the stories quite a bit. The Channel 3 project, to go into that a little more deeply, I would advise that you go check out radiofreereadout.com or Amron. It's either .com or .net. Those aren't my sites, but what the Channel 3 project and that net does is it allows people, ham radio technicians, to work together on a frequency, set up a net in their area, and once they get established, they start trying to fold in other people who may be part of Amron and are believe in this Channel 3 project but don't have ham radio licenses themselves. But the thing about people don't realize is with ham radio is it's free to listen to. You don't have to have a license to listen in. If you can own the radio, you can listen in. You just can't transmit without being a licensed technician or higher level, classification. But with Channel 3, those ham radio operators who aren't the net control will then go out and make contacts with people. So an FRS radio would literally be what we call the blister pack radios. You can go buy a 2-pack or 4-pack of these little radios at Costco or Sam's Club or your sporting goods store, and they usually get maybe a half-mile range or a mile range, depends on the actual terrain and things like that. But there's other types of radio frequency bands that you can use as a non-ham. One's called MERS, one's called CB, obviously old school CB stuff. And so the Channel 3 project basically designates, hey, after an emergency or during a practice net, everyone's going to check in on Channel 3 on one of these systems and relay their status and information and stuff back to one of the ham radio operators that's talking to them on these non-licensed frequencies. They will then in turn relay that information back up to the Channel 3 net, who can then relay it to a national larger net or to their local emergency services if they need to. So basically, I like to use the analogy, it's like the blood system, whereas the ham radio technicians and other experienced radio operators may be the veins or the arteries. Really getting down into Channel 3 where you're using those non-licensed things, that's the capillaries. You're trying to get down to the nitty-gritty, as far out down the chain of communication as you can. Because in the end, if military veterans and active duty and stuff kind of know this term, but basically shoot, move, and communicate is a tactical superiority when it comes to being able to, take on a threat. But those same principles apply to emergency preparedness. Maybe not the shoot so much unless your life is being threatened, but the ability to move, the ability to communicate are skills that are going to affect and impact everyone when there's some sort of natural disaster or something. And really, the Channel 3 is just about getting people that information flow down to the nitty-gritty, the lowest nooks and crannies and back. So another thing that's in this can that I talked about is the family comms plan. And so what I've done is, and I encourage everyone to learn how to program the radios, both manually and with Chirp software or some other software system. The reason I advise that is they're not all the same. A lot of people get into preparedness, go and buy 10 Baofeng radios, and then they never practice learning how to program this thing. Those are pretty ideal to be programmed with software. Try to program them manually. It's pretty abusive to you mentally, right? It's a pain. But then I have a home base station. It's really kind of a car system, but it's called an ICOM 2370, 2730. Yeah, whichever. And it doesn't program with the Chirp software at all, but it is very user friendly when you're trying to program it using the buttons on the back of the mic. So first of all, learn how to program your stuff multiple ways. And secondly, you need to set up some sort of family communications plan. And so in the case of our family, my sons are not ham radio technicians, my wife is. So in addition to having a printout of how the radios are programmed, so what channel is what, and I did that logically. I started with all the channels that you wouldn't be transmitting on that you can listen to, fire and EMS, and that's one color in my spreadsheet. And then it goes into the free-to-use frequency bands. And I got not just the frequency, but various details and information that they might want to use. And then the plan, the spreadsheet itself continues on to various repeaters and single network or simplex frequencies that I've got programmed into the channels in our radios. Even got a few weather channels in there. But if there's ever an emergency, my sons or someone who's got access to one of these family comms plans could bust it out, and there's just a Word doc in there that says, hey, if you're a ham, do this. If you're not a ham, do this. And it's going to drive them to how to put the antenna on the radio, how to key it up, how to use the A or B frequencies properly, what to listen for, and then if they're not a ham, they can even try to do an emergency break. I need to relay information during this emergency into a proper ham radio network that they may be able to listen to, right? Because after a real emergency, you know, your local community ham clubs as well as the local DEM or whatever is going to be running ham radio nets, and it's free for during an emergency for a non-licensed person to have the liberty to be able to break in and relay some information. So that said, the family comms plan is a big deal because it drives your family what channel, how to use the radio, how to relay information. Even if you can't talk to me on the radio and you get a hold of some organized network, how you're going to relay information and how they'll get a hold of me, right? So I guess that's a big part of preparedness. I think other than fitness, and it's the one I'm working on right now, that's my biggest challenge is carb and sugar addiction. But other than that, I'm going to say the biggest abused or ignored preparedness item is and continues to be organized communications. And once you pull that thread, you can really go down it far. And a lot of people, the problem is they're not really into ham like a lot of the ham radio guys are. You start with analog, but then you start getting into digital. You can use automatic packet relay system. Do you have the right gear? You can actually see where the other people that you're talking to are on a map with digital communications. There are, and I mentioned a system in my books called Gotenna, which is a mesh network. And as long as you've got the programming done ahead of time, you and your phones and everyone in your little group can use a mesh network to text each other on phones, regardless of whether or not the cellular system is up and running. So there are all kinds of different ways out there to use communications as what we call a force multiplier, which is to be able to relay information. Remember, I said that a little bit ago. It's kind of a shoot, move, communicate if you're looking at it militarily. But all of those things, defense, motion, and communication are all applicable to civilian preparedness too.
Well, that's all I have for this video. Bang around that bell icon if you want to be notified when new videos come out. Call us on the hotline if you have comments or questions and want to be featured in an upcoming video. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, check us out on the website, and we'll see you guys on the next one.